My guest today is Rachel Flemming. Rachel, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
You're so welcome. Rachel, you are an intuitive life coach and Reiki Master, guiding soul-led women on their path to greatness. You help women to activate and actualize their life purpose and their soul purpose as well. And your mission is to guide those women back home to themselves. Now, those are really beautiful words. And I want to explore your work. And I want to explore your work because I know you do one-to-one and you do group women as well, which is really close to your heart. So let's just start maybe with the one-to-one, see if that's okay.
Okay.
Right.
Um, so you and I have known each other for
We have.
some years, and we have spent time together in person, doing inner work. So it's really lovely, first of all, to have this conversation with you. And I have a background in teaching women's yoga and women's wellness. I came through like a classical yoga training, a monastic yoga training, which I did in India. And I was reflecting on that today, actually. I was driving back. I've been in Oxford. I was driving back, and I was thinking about you were saying, oh, let's talk about this and this, and that time in my life was, oh, I would say it was a coming back to my soul and a coming back to my relationship with God. And it was joyous. I hadn't felt that much happiness, in my body for so long. It wasn't from the physical experience of doing yoga. It was my reconnection with my soul. Now, I was 37 then. And I would say I have only come into real awareness of being able to explain the work I do recently, which sounds a little bit crazy, right? So in my one-to-one, no, I know we've all had journeys in our lives, haven't we? So
Yes.
I'd say that my one-to-one work now especially is a condensation of my life's experience, my commitment to my inner world, and being able to hear, see, and feel the soul path of whoever's in front of me. Now, I didn't know that that's what it was before, but I've done that for a long time in different guises. So my one-to-one work blends psychic visioning, a very kind of simple life coaching, energy work, soul retrieval. Sometimes I find the labels difficult because what I do in partnership with the person in front of me, most of my clients are women, but I have started to work with men as well, is I receive them. Right, I receive them in that moment. I know you understand this, in that moment, who they are, and I receive their past, their present, and their future all at the same time. And I can see and sense what is holding them back, like that return to wholeness. That's, I don't know, maybe briefly what I do.
Well, I mean, when I read your introduction, I think the words are so beautifully put. Um, and very often, as therapists, and we try to really find what discerns us or what is really within us. And words are very difficult to find to express the sort of work that you and I do in some ways.
Yeah.
So, thinking about that, when you talk about holding a soul space, now there'll be people who'll be wondering what you mean. Could you say a little bit more about that? And how do you hold it? And for example, if some messages come through, how do they come through and how do you receive them?
Okay. Great question. So with every single person that I work with, my first intention is to create a sacred space for them. So I do that every single time for myself and for them. So I work online and in person. The bulk of my clients come to see me in person. That's fascinating to me, right? Especially because of the world that we live in. So whatever is happening, there is a sacred container for them to step into, in order that they know that what is going to take place between us is sacred and has deep meaning. That's very important to me. And as much as I can is I as much as I can, how can I put this? I was going to say I make them feel safe. That is, I don't think any of us are able to do that for another human being, but I will create the most beneficial surroundings or container for them to feel as safe as they possibly can. So
yeah, I mean, when you say, when you say sacred, Rachel, in a way, to me, that encompasses an invitation to feel safe.
Right.
You know, I mean, maybe you can say a little bit about how you make that space sacred, you know, through your mind or through things that you do in your room, perhaps.
Right. So yeah, I live in an old house, and my living room feels like a womb space, right? It has a warmth, and there's lots of colors in it, pictures of my family and my children, and I have flowers, and there's lots of stone, and you know, probably about 35 blankets, knowing me, right? It has this welcoming, it's a homecoming kind of a space, right? The way that I present myself in the world is, you know, I'm a big character, you know, I have big energy, right? I have big energy, but I have this real warmth about me, and that's what I provide. But it's a sacred thing. You can see there's, you know, there's images of nature and the goddess, from all different traditions. You can kind of feel the prayer in the room, right? And I have a reverence for that person's mind, body, spirit, and soul when they walk in. And I create the space so that they know that and they feel it. You know, people come in and go, oh, yeah, that all of my clients do that, you know, because I spend a lot of time creating this, you know, really precious container for them to, it's, I suppose, if I was going to distill it, they know that they matter.
Yes, you make them
you
feel
know
really comfortable and welcome in your space, and
right.
they can relax and they can start trusting you, basically, isn't it? But
Yeah.
how do you receive those messages? Because I know you're very psychic, really, and very intuitive. And I'm
Yeah.
curious to know whether the messages are just sort of something that you know as you talk, or something that you see or you feel. Tell us about that, Rachel.
Okay. So maybe could give you a little bit of history of that.
Yes.
I would say that I developed my psychic abilities when I was about 4 years old. And without going into great depth and telling you long stories, because, you know, I love to do that, but I was able to do what I do now from a young age. I don't have great memories of my childhood, but I do remember having an amazingly strong connection with God. And I would say to God, I'll give you a story. I was like, God, I don't want to be a nun this lifetime. That's the conversation I would have with him. And at the time it was a him for me, but I was maybe 6 when I started having, I was like, no, I don't want to be a nun, really, like a 6-year-old. And that was the kind of conversation I was having. But now, as a postmenopausal 52-year-old woman, I know that I had this psychic connection with the world, and how I used it, how could I say, it enabled me to know whether people were safe or a threat. Does that make sense?
It does.
Like,
Yeah.
as a kid, I was like, stay away from that. Seriously, stay away from them. And I trusted it because it was linked to my conversations with God. So that's how I started it. And it would be probably reborn in me in my 30s. So you asked me how I experience my intuition. I hear voices, not from an auditory perspective. I hear them in my body. Sometimes they're very loud. I don't see things with my eyes, but I am able to perceive, I would say, again with my body, lots of stuff. So I can see someone's soul and I can hear how their soul talks to them. So that kicks in quite quickly. I know when they're using a head voice or a soul voice. I literally have this, I'll explain it really literally to you. If you were telling me something in your life, this is what happens. When you utter a word, it slows down in my mind.
Wow.
Right? It slows down in my mind. And then anything else you say after that, I don't hear so well. So I know that word is part of the problem. So I will stop a client and say, I want you to go back to that. And as I say that, my intuition tells me what it's about. They tell me the story even before the client tells me the story. They will say, Mom, Dad, I don't know, fear, shame, childhood, or so there's that. And that is often coupled with a picture of them. And again, I experience it in my body at that time in their life. Say if I'm doing some soul retrieval work.
Wow.
That's
Yeah. So you go to the core really of the whatever they need to work with,
right.
you know?
Yeah. And it happens quickly.
Mm.
It happens, I would say, if you were going to do a session with me, it happens within 15 minutes.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean,
I mean,
yes, it is amazing.
I'm a bit speechless right now because I think it's absolutely just amazing to hear. And through the body, and I think I've always noticed that in you, Rachel, if you don't mind me saying, is that,
Yeah.
in the classes that we were in together, you were always really in touch with your body.
Yeah.
Really in touch
That's
with what was happening, how it felt, what it
yeah.
meant to you, and beyond. And that's exactly
Right.
what you're telling me now, perceiving the body.
Yes.
But to do it for other people,
Yes.
it's absolutely a godsend, shall I say?
Right. And I trust it. I trust my body. I'm quite playful, as you know. And so if something comes through my body, I'm like, whoa, this is fun, right? I don't discount it, or I believe it. It's my truth, right? The
Yes,
physical experience in my body. And I kind of I'm quite stubborn. I won't hear that it's not the truth, right? Because I'm just like, it's my truth right now. And also, obviously, my truth changes because I change, the world changes,
of course.
it's not a fixed thing, but in that moment of being present to myself and the person in front of me, it's the truth. And I would say 100% of the time, it blends well. Like, the right people show up in front of me. The people who I'm not meant to work with aren't in front of me. Does that make sense?
Oh,
Like,
totally.
other force keeps them away.
I get that a lot in my practice. I find that I actually, the people who actually will benefit from working with me tend to come with me. I mean, now and then, and maybe because I'm not in alignment, I don't know, but now and then I might get a client who I think, I wonder why this person chose me. But usually it's also works the other way when people look, they look at your website or social media, and very often they'll say to me, well, I saw your work and I looked at your website and straight away I knew I had to work with you.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you talk about that. Why do you talk about that?
Why do I talk about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Can
Yes.
I tell you why I'm asking you that question?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Because most of the people who work with me have to meet me first. So yes, that's a cute, you can see me smiling. I find that quite fascinating. Like, I'll meet my clients in fields walking dogs, or in a shop, or
So there's got
as
to
I'm
be
getting my it's really
physical.
interesting. There is something about physicality and maybe okay, so my guys just said, yeah, that's it. It's the body thing that is it's like that's my catalyst.
Yes. And I can't answer that question really for myself because I don't know. I don't know. And they don't have necessarily to see me, but perhaps, if they're on social media, they also hear you. And so
Right.
through the voice, I mean, I very often when I look for people to interview, I will go and find whether they match with me. And I know in a way the people who I'm not gonna, because their energy is maybe too fast for me or too complicated.
Right.
Yeah, so you can feel it. That's the way I would explain is that I just feel it. And I
It's a
think
feeling.
yeah. So when to go back to the messages that you get, you mentioned
Yeah.
like I think you mentioned something like when somebody comes in my body. So do you mean that maybe entities are actually visiting you while you have the sessions?
Good question. Um, so so what's been happening more recently, maybe the last 2 years, is I start to see, hear, and feel people's ancestors. So that was, you know,
That's big.
helpful. I
That
was
is
like,
big.
oh, I've got colleagues, right? And again, I received it with joy and gratitude. I'm not a psychic medium. That is just one way. Yeah, they're allies. Well, they're allies for my clients, and I receive them in lots of different ways. They show up for the person in front of me this is how I perceive it, they have how can I say, they have a specific job role in that person's life. So
Absolutely.
mainly grandmas and granddads.
Yes.
I get a lot of grandparents in my living room.
Because I think it's in transgenealogy, which is the French word. I don't know if you can say it in English.
Yeah. Genealogy. Yeah.
Genealogy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very often I have found when I had some sessions myself that actually the grandparents are really, really important.
Yeah.
And the fact that you are calling them on, they're coming to you really because you are with this person. I think it's amazing because you can do so much liberation, some release for those people because our ancestor, let's face it, what hasn't been worked through can go down a
Right.
generation and someone would pick it up somewhere unconsciously and try to
Yeah.
make it better or it can create a lot of problems in somebody's life, but that is not to say that it
Right.
can't be healed. And what I'm
Right.
hearing from your session, well, that's possible to do with you.
Right. And their presence is, and this is just my experience, and it's very limited, but their presence is very supportive, right? It's that ancestral support. It's the knowing of soul spirits, you know, who are on the other side. There's a lot more wisdom. It's really, it's a comfort. I would say that is the word I would use. Knowing that these allies are there, and they're quite playful, and, you know, often stand behind the person, or, you know, sit down in a chair, and they bear witness to the soul healing that person is, you know, experiencing.
Mm. And seeing them as allies is beautiful, because really that's what they are, and they can help us move on. But obviously we have free will, so we need to do the work ourselves, don't we?
Right. And it having them there, I mean, this might sound odd, but it's quite a human experience, I would say. You know, having someone's grandparents who have passed on sitting there, is a really human experience. Yeah, it's loving and patient, and, you know, I mean, you know, humans have different aspects to their behavior, but that is very, it's unpretentious.
Mm-hmm. And
That's what
some
I would say.
people, yes, you're absolutely right. Some people would say that in order to get release from maybe an attachment that we have to an ancestor, you need to have an emotional outburst of some kind. I
Right.
know I had. So I'm interested to know in your sessions, when you see that happening, if you have seen that, um, is it possible to release it with gentleness, kindness,
Right.
or do you always have to have this sort of big release, emotional outburst?
Right. That's a good question. I would say that if anyone has had an emotional release in the work that I've been put on the earth to do, it's not explosive. It has a lot of vulnerability about it. There are most people in the first session with me will cry, you know, men, women, non-binary, whoever they are. So there is a softening before their beginnings of their transition. So there's a softening, there's an understanding of, from the body, what needs to be attended to first, energetically. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you haven't been at pain, you haven't been, you know, mindful, or you haven't paid attention to your heart, your womb. You know, it really is, that's quite sort of early level stuff, but that can come through quite quickly. And then the soul retrieval stuff often comes on the back of that. And
So
some people, I mean, sometimes we don't do any soul retrieval. Sometimes it is just pure, almost pure energy. I do a lot of guided visualization, and someone just needs to come into the opposite state that they've been existing in. Does that make sense?
it does, yeah. And
It's
as you're
like they come
speaking,
out of the storm, you know, so the storm
out of the
happens
storm.
before the session with me, right? They usually have a breakdown, and then they come and see me.
Yes.
So great question. It doesn't happen in my space, I would say, in general.
It's very interesting. You know, you mentioned also the soul retrieval work. Now, some people might wonder what it means.
Mm.
So tell me about the work that you do around that, and how can you explain it?
Okay. So I haven't done a shamanic training. Um, maybe I should speak a little bit about my training or otherwise. I am trained by my ancestors and the goddess. That's who trains me. So I've done hundreds of trainings. Well, hundreds, maybe that's an exaggeration. It is an exaggeration, but I've done a lot of trainings. And I would say, yeah, it's my granny who trains me, right? It's the earth that trains me. So soul retrieval, I read a book about soul retrieval. And in the middle of reading that book, I didn't really know why I was reading it. Someone gave it to me and said, "Oh, you want to read this book?" And I was like, oh, "Okay." And it was a good book, but it wasn't, I didn't seek it out, but clearly it was like landed on my on my lap or in my hands. And when I was reading this book, soul retrieval started happening in my work.
Wow, that's incredible. But you know, Rachel, you don't have to have 100 diplomas to be good at something. You know, that just gives people maybe confidence to do their work. And of course, it's not about not doing any training at all, but your
Right.
granny, if your granny is leading you where you need to go, you've got the
Yeah.
best training there, haven't you, in a way?
Yeah. Yeah. And so you asked me, did you ask me how it looks?
Ah,
So
yeah.
um I'm trying to sort of think of an example of someone who I've worked with
Hmm.
recently. So I spoke to you about the process of the words slowing down.
Yes, you did.
And often I get that reminder or a like a nudge, go there. And I would ask my client to close their eyes. And sometimes I ask them to locate themselves in a space in the body. Um, so I do this sort of simple exercise, and I'm sure that it can be done in lots of different, therapies or what have you, but I call it head, heart, womb. So it's bringing an experience into different energetic centers of the body so that you can really embody it and understand it. So we'll do something like that, or a condensed version of that. And if a soul retrieval is coming through, it's very obvious quite quickly that is happening, because a previous version of themselves will turn up. And I keep it really in the physical realm. I'm like, how old are you? What are you wearing? Where are you? So it comes from the body, which is like, it's like the translator, and then you move into the soul space. And in shamanic understanding, you can have the upper, middle, and lower worlds, and I have some understanding of that, but it happens on a much simpler level for me. I use the body to access what the person is experiencing, and it happens really quickly. They can see it clearly. They're in that time, they are that person, and I get the now version of themselves to communicate with their person then. And then we just discover what's going on.
And so that really makes me think of parallel lives or past lives, as some people call it.
Right.
There's something similar in that, in what you're
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Which
And
is
I think
interesting.
past lives have a similar role in our healing journey. you know um Past lives don't come through to me often. They do sometimes, but in a very, like, I would say, again, practical way. They drop in, like I get a snippet of them, almost like soul retrieval. It's a time in that life which is dropping in to instruct this person that this is what's going on, and it's time to release it and let it go and move on. So I love past life work, and I've done lots of it for me, and it's been amazing. And this because we've been in a sort of similar space. But each of those experiences, they're stories that that we're being asked kindly and gently to let go of, because we're not in that story anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about leaving it behind. I mean, I know what you're talking about. I mean, in my book that I wrote, I speak about my past lives, which have been
Right.
sort of downloaded, a lot of it, and some of them were confirmed with the same person that we saw together, where we
Yeah.
learned, and by other mediums. So I just find it really fascinating. But it's so nice to hear someone like you talk about it in a different way, with different words. So I want to move on now, Rachel, to your amazing group work. As you say, you hold women. And I was really, really touched because it's something that I'm not familiar with, to be with women a lot and, to connect with a lot of women at the same time, I mean.
Yeah.
So when you say helping women with the intimate part of themselves, and you talk a lot about the womb being the gateway to the soul, about the feminine, the cycles of life. So
Yeah.
I'm going to leave you to talk about your women's circles and how did you decide to do this? Why? And how do you do them?
Okay. Great question. So this was a part of my transitional journey into motherhood, and then very quickly into perimenopause. I had been a yoga teacher for a year, and also trying to conceive, with not a lot of success. So I'd heard about this person called Uma Dinsmore Tooley, who is one of my teachers. She is a women's yoga therapist, an activist, and author. She is a powerful force. And I made the decision to sign up to her pregnancy yoga teacher training. So I came into that space with her, and at the time, I'd also made this decision I was 39 then, go on fertility treatment, because we were fortunate enough to get 2 courses of treatment on the NHS, because I was an older woman, so at the time that was available. And I was really, really anti doing that. I was like, I do not want this stuff in my body. But this theme repeats a lot in my life. I made steps towards surrender, right? I was like, okay, so let's do it. So I embarked on a course of treatment called IUI, which is like a mini version of IVF. It's like artificial insemination, but the woman has to go through all the processes that IVF does. So I was embarking on that, and I embarked on this yoga teacher training. I will come to the point, but this is an important part of the story. So it's a 6-day course. I'm in London. 5th day, I have this total, I don't even know what I would call it, but I remember seeing this picture of a baby passing through the birth canal, and I was disgusted by it. And I was like, 2 things. First of all, shit, I'm disgusted by it. And then I was like, I should not be disgusted by this, right? This is problematic, I would say that. So I went home, and throughout the whole day, and in a yoga teacher training, you do them on the floor, right? You're on mats on the floor the whole day. I couldn't sit up all day. I was basically prostrate through this whole day of this training. I couldn't even tell you what we were studying, but clearly that didn't go into my awareness. And as I came into the last day of the course, I walked into the studio, and this came to me: no one has ever taught you how to be a woman. And I was like, wow. So 10 days later, I was pregnant.
Wow.
So yeah, I had an initiation. And the reason I talk about this training is it was Uma who taught me about sitting in circle with other women. I was fortunate enough to live in Bristol at the time. I still do, but she was teaching classes in Bristol. And so I went straight from the training into her classes once a week. And very quickly, she was like, I'm going away for 4 weeks. Will you teach? Will you teach one of these classes? So that it all happened really, really quickly. I was pregnant. And I came into this incredible community of women who, many of them I'm still friends with now. You talked about the experience of it. It was something like I had never experienced before. It was this homecoming feeling. My whole body went, oh, all right. It was acceptance. It was being witnessed. It was rest. It was curious and kind and magnificent. It was the whole experience was flooded with oxytocin, because that's what happens when groups of women come together. Our oxytocin, which is the drug that you have when you give birth and you breastfeed your children, when you sit with other women, this also, it peaks. And so that began my journey of sitting in circle with women, facilitating circles for women. So I've been doing that, I don't know, since 2010.
So would it be right to say that this gave you, in a way, permission to feel your femininity, to feel like you embodied a woman, and that was something important that maybe you were not taught before? Or I don't know. What do you think about that?
I'm pausing at the word permission. I struggle with
Yeah.
that word.
I
I'm
mean,
a bit of a rebel, right?
yeah. No, but I mean, maybe it's not the right word, but I mean permission, to give permission to yourself
I think
to
that's a good word. I think,
actually, this is what I mean, to embody the whole of you, not just your intellect, but also your femininity, but also your strength as a woman, because you are a strong woman, all of
right.
it. But maybe before we're not able to do that for some
I
reason.
think what occurred to me was that it was available. I was like, oh, I can do
Okay,
this.
that's a good word.
Right. So it
Yeah.
wasn't right. I was like, oh, it's
Yeah.
available. And then I was like, I was kind of, I talk about this playfulness again. I was observing my body and I was like, oh, she loves it. Right. That's what it was. She loves it. Like, it was just glorious. It was just such a different feeling from most of my adult life as a woman. I was like,
Yes,
where have I been? Like, what have I been doing?
because
Like this was.
you say, Rachel, that you have been the keeper of women's stories for many years.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
yeah,
What does
yeah.
that
And I
mean?
think that's, yeah, that phrase came to me a few years ago, and witnessing people's soul paths. Um, I receive I received the story at the time. Now, before I did any of this stuff, I used to work in recruitment, so finding jobs for people. So I have listened to thousands of people's stories, literally thousands of people's stories, and I hold them in my body. I still remember many of the people that I met, but what I remember about them most is their stories. And I I can say that now, sort of with perspective, looking back, reflecting backwards, if you like. I was like, that's what I was doing. I was able to hear and feel and see their souls then. And I would encourage them to tell me about their stories, because then I could sort of, I mean, this sounds weird, I could sort of sense them and taste them and smell them. Like I understood who they were as a whole person. not just a CV or a set of skills, or I never saw people as commodities. I saw them as like this whole story unfolding. And as I became older and did more of this work, I realized I was like, oh, I'm the keeper of women's stories. I keep them really close to me.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
But I don't hold them tightly, you know. They go into, like, you know, we did a meditation before we started out. They go into the ground when they're ready to.
Yeah. So
So that makes
let's
sense.
move on, if you don't mind, because all you're
Yeah,
saying is so beautiful, but I'm sure everybody's dying to know what is happening in those women's circle and how do you hold them?
sure. So they've changed over time. I used to do it from a yoga perspective, so bringing in music and movement and beauty, and in the early days bringing in sort of a menstruality consciousness or awareness of a menstrual cycle. But as I got older and wiser, I dropped some of that away because that wasn't happening in a regular way in my life, right? So they simplified as I got older. I became quieter as they got older. So the core of the circle is to sit in circle. And there's a beautiful, I think it's Lakota wisdom that talks about, you know, in a circle, no one is behind you or in front of you, above you or below you. And the circle is about unity. So there is a real magic that happens in a circle, men or women, children, grandmothers, whatever.
Men are
It
allowed to come.
comes, well, the ones that I have been doing, not so much, because it's been based around the womb. But, you know, that is not to say that that won't develop in my work as I go forward. But initially it was through the lens of women's health, right? And we were talking about what happened physically in a woman's body, but how that impacts the mind, body, spirit, and soul. But a lot of the movement started to move away. And really the magic is what we call the share. It's women telling their story at the time. It's spoken out into the circle. The circle always has a centerpiece or an altar, which brings, you know, the sacred into it. And I spoke to you about the one-to-one stuff. This is just the same. It's no different. Women are encouraged to rest, perceive beauty, contribute to that beauty. But everything that is shared in a circle is then not shared out with that circle. So the sanctum, the sacred, is kept in that moment. Now, what I would love to share with you as well, and I say this in every circle, and I've done a lot of them, is that each circle, it's really magic, holds you in some way for the rest of your life. So how you experience that is you might have sat in circle, and magic always happens. They're really magical spaces, but something that someone said in a circle will drop into your life, maybe even like 15 years later. And you know that that group of humans held you at that time. And you know, time doesn't exist, right? The past, the present, and the future is all happening at the same time. That's where some of the magic comes in. So that's a little snippet of what happens in a circle.
Wow. You know, the mind goes to constellation when you say that. I mean, I don't know a huge amount, but maybe enough to think that it's the people around you are really taking part in your story.
Yeah.
As you speak.
Often the woman or the person, but, you know, in this case, in my history, it's been women. The woman sitting opposite you is reflecting your story. I mean, the depth in it it's deep. It's very deep and very magic. And it's co-created. It's nothing to do with me. You know, I just create the container. Just create the container and hold quiet space.
So you talk a lot about the beauty of it and the sacredness of it, which is amazing. What about if someone, had an outburst, like something has come up from the past, and they suddenly start crying or reacting, shaking? Have you ever had something like that?
There's usually, well, it depends. It depends. It depends on the collection of people, you know, who's gathered there. There's often at least some very deep emotional experience being talked about or expressed. Sometimes there's lots of that, you know, grief, loss, death, shame, whatever, all the things, right? All the things as we travel through the phases in our life, the cycles in our lives. It depends, really depends on the circle. I mean, that's a fascinating question, because sometimes there's a season of, you know, types of issues that come up, and sometimes it's almost like the whole circle is experiencing like a collective grief or joy or outrage. Sometimes the circle represents, you know, all the things that you can go through in your life. It really depends. It's up to the circle, really. Like, you know, a theme doesn't cut it. It's like the women are bringing the energy of what comes through, but often there's very deep emotion. I wouldn't say this, I don't think anyone's ever broken down, but very emotional, you know. It's the fabric of our lives as humans. That's what they bring. It's
And
very real.
Very real, very raw sometimes, and you can never really predict or even program your circle. It doesn't work like that. You know, it's in the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as a facilitator or a space holder, over time, I have learned to hold the space more tenderly, more deeply, more quietly. I don't come into physical contact with the women during the circle, and I'm a very touchy-feely, huggy person. And the more I become skilled at that through experience, I do also notice that I'm modeling that for the people there.
That's really amazing. Rachel, I want to ask you, what is a memorable session that you've had? You know, we always have some that stick in our minds for one reason or another. This could be a group session, but it could also be a one-to-one sessions, which in a way is more maybe easier to tell. But does something come to mind? Something that you thought, wow, or maybe it's like that every time.
Okay, I'll give you two. So one is a one-to-one with a dear friend of mine, and I'm sure she won't mind me sharing this with you because it's not too much of her personal story. But this is back in 2019, so before lockdown, and I was working in a healing space now. I would call myself a healer then. And she's like, I really need some healing. And I was like, okay. And it came to the day and I was like, she's like, I'm really tired. And I was like, I'm really tired. And I said, okay, let's try it on WhatsApp. Okay. So she's on her sofa or in her bed or whatever. And I am on my sofa, right? And she comes on the phone on the screen, and just before that I kind of am aware, and again I explain it to you, in my body, right? But I knew that this was happening in my physical space. Quite a few old Jewish people came into my living room and pulled up chairs and sat down. And I said, do you have Jewish ancestry? And she was like, yes. And I was like, well, they're all in my living room. So that's one memorable experience. And, you know, I'm not going to tell you what happened in the one-to-one because, again, I keep that quite sacrosanct for people. But, you know, from my point of view, I was like, okay, then this is what we're doing now, you know? So I would say every single session I do is weird and fun and joyous. And I mean, none of them are normal. But they're very personal to the person who has showed up. You know, they get good value for money. That's what I would say. So I never use like an identikit, I never use a series of, I don't know, methodologies. Everything is tailored towards them. So that's the one-to-one story. The group story, now this is a great one. So I used to sing a lot, you know, devotional stuff from many traditions at the end of the circle. And women are great when they get into singing. I don't know if you've ever been in that experience. So we're in this space in Bristol and it's very weathery outside, right? It's kind of raining and we started singing. And what happens when women are making sounds? We were kind of omming sounds or like toning, you know. It starts to sound like there are hundreds of people in the room. And that's almost always the case, especially if women are getting into it. Some kind of beautiful magic that happens. And this up and down is happening. And I'm thinking, oh, it's so good. And then it starts to thunder and lightning outside. Like the outside is joining in. And the more the weather there was, the more the women had this realization that they were creating it. It was brilliant. So, you know, and then, you know, the lightning and thunder just, you know, went away and the sound got quieter and there was a little bit of quiet. And then, you know, when the women all opened their eyes, they looked like more alive than they'd been in a long time. You know what I mean? They were like, oh, we're magic.
I know. Excuse me. It's absolutely wonderful. But you know, it's good to remind yourself about it, Rachel, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
very often, I mean, it does happen, especially when you are with clients, yes. And
right.
whether it's the sun coming out, and yes, of course, some people will say, "Oh, that's just chance," you know. But there are always synchronicities and signs in
Right.
our lives if we can see them, if we allow them to see them. So
Right.
so you know, it's not to be blasé about it and say, "Oh yeah," you know, but actually to take some time and say, "Yeah, actually, it is wonderful, and it has a spiritual meaning, and it's all
Right.
amazing that all those women experience that together." And
Right.
I love the story about the people sitting in your living room because you had the whole thing in front of you already, which is lovely.
Right. And it had never happened before. And I was like, okay, welcome.
That was the first time it happened to you, yeah?
Yeah.
Wow, that's something, isn't it?
I mean,
So we're galloping through time and coming to the end of our lovely interview, Rachel. And of course, I will put all your details below if somebody wants to reach out. And
thank you, Darlene.
you're most welcome. I wanted to ask you a last thing. You know, in
Mm.
those times of a lot of people are unhappy, have difficulties. And of course, I always say to people, don't watch the news or maybe watch once every 3 days because everything is a catastrophe out there.
Yeah.
So, how can we what advice would you have to people to keep themselves centered and away from the chaos? Because I believe that you cannot feel your own peace through the chaos. So
Mm.
for me, it's about staying in peace and away from the vibration of violence as much as possible without having your
Mm.
head in the sand.
Mm.
How do you
Really
see
good
all that?
question.
And what would be your advice?
Okay. This is a great question because it's one that I'm asking myself several times a day at the moment. And I would maybe share with maybe two things I would share with you. There's a practice that I do for myself, and sometimes I teach my clients this, but I use it mostly in my day, right? So I bring my hands out like this, and it's a reminder to me that I hold the grief of the world and my life, and I hold the joy of the world in my life. And I feel it energetically, and I hold them out at the same time, and understand that I have to hold them at the same time in order to keep my center. So yeah, I am one not to look away from, the horrors of the world. I tend to expose myself to them, and but I also take care of myself like well, right? I would say just understand what your role is in history right now. Understand what your role is in your life, what your role is in history. Yeah, like you say, don't put your head in the sand, because, well, why are we human, right? But you have to understand that your life is also joyous, it's also precious, and like you say, your peace is important. So it's about balance, and it's about coming away from divisiveness, which we're exposed to a lot, about them and us. Simplify it. I would pray a lot. That's how I
Pray,
do it, is I pray.
meditate, just into a space
Yeah.
where you can ask. And of course, about what you just said, I really feel that we all have a different role anyway, don't we, in this life?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
for example, I have my best friend, she's a big activist. So she would go
Right.
marching every day, not every day, sorry,
Right.
every week,
I get
you
it.
know.
Yeah.
And she'd go off to Paris and somewhere else, and because she lives in
Yeah.
France. Other people are just holding um,
Right.
something in a different way. Other people are
Right.
just very active with charities and things like that, and other people are just
Yeah.
writing about it. So there is
Yeah.
different ways in a way to suit, I was going to say, your personality, because you can't really go against
Yeah.
you.
And
Mm.
your body,
And your
Isabel,
body.
and your
Yeah,
body. Know what your capacity is, and this is like this is the stuff that I do. Like, we all have our own path, we all show up differently, because we've all incarnated to do something in, like, it's like, what's your flavor? Understand that and stick to it and be true to it, and respond to humanity in that way, and you can't go wrong.
we all have our own
um
lessons to learn and are, reaching an even higher level of consciousness as we go on. So,
right.
but we all equal. That's for sure.
Yeah, it takes some courage, I would say.
Yeah, it's not an easy place to be, Earth, is it?
No, and if you do the work that you do, and I do the work that I do, and we are speaking some level of truth, and there are lots of different ways that truth can be spoken, right? It can be lonely because it can be uncomfortable. Be all right with being uncomfortable, I would say that, and then you will be fully or more alive than you were yesterday.
That's really good advice. Yeah, absolutely. And notice all the little miracles, all the little signs, and all the little synchronicity,
Yeah.
because that's where, in a way, our joy is, I would say.
Right.
And a
And
miracle happens.
and when I used to come into the space, we, like, I mentioned our teachers. We had a teacher called Louise Chalice, and Isabel and I studied together for like many years. It was so much fun. And what I remember about you is you used to bring these, oh my God, delightful little packages of beautifully prepared food in like lovely containers, and everyone was like, oh, and that was your joy that you brought to the world, and to like a small group of people, but like it was obviously potent, because I really remember that. That's one of your little moments of magic that you bring into being.
So sweet of you to say that. I just think maybe some people say, oh, it's because you're French. I don't know. I think it's because in this life, something that's important to me is seeing beauty. I love
Yeah,
seeing beauty.
yeah,
My definition in beauty would be different to someone else's, of course. And we're all beautiful because we're all beautiful souls at heart,
yeah.
on a level, on a high level. But yeah, I just love aesthetics. So I suppose that's my thing. For some people, it won't be important at all, but they will
Right.
concentrate on something else.
Yeah. I really
Um,
appreciate that about you.
Thank you so much. So, Rachel, thank you so much for being my guest today. It was fascinating, and I'm sure that people will find it very interesting too. You've always been a very fun and flamboyant character to be with, but you're healing because I have experienced it in snippets through our training together.
Yeah.
And it always felt, I've got goose pimple when I say that, and that's always a good sign that I'm really speaking of what it is.
Mm.
So soft. The healing is very holding, very like this, comforting
Mm.
and powerful. So thank you for being my guest. It was really, really beautiful. And I wish you all the best, and I hope to see you soon.
Oh, me too. Thank you, Isabel. It was such an honor to be with you.